So yeah, thank you all so much for joining in for this conversation today. The way it's going to work is that I've got a little bit of an introduction as to why Critical's hosting this consultation. And then I hope we can have a bit more of a chat about how you view the changes and other things that you think that we should be focusing on. So I'll be recording this first part, but when it comes time to chat, I'm going to stop the recording just so that we can talk a little bit more freely without having to worry about it being recorded forever. So I'll just start with some acknowledgements. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we're coming on from today. I'm on the land of the Ngunnawal people, and I recognise their elders past and present, and recognise that sovereignty was never ceded. I also recognise the immense value that lived experience brings to suicide prevention. It's why we're having this discussion today. The inclusion of people with lived experience is a must for all the future activities that we do when it comes to suicide prevention. So I come from the perspective of surviving a suicide attempt, experiencing thoughts of suicide, and also caring for a loved one through thoughts of suicide and suicide attempts. And I've been involved in the sector as an advisor for over 10 years, but this has morphed into more of a stronger advocacy focus. I'm also about halfway through a PhD that's looking at how people like me do suicide prevention work. And if you haven't heard of Critical, I started the organisation just over a year ago to start critical conversations in the suicide prevention sector as it related to the inclusion of and partnerships with people with lived experience. And a key part of this advocacy is today's conversation on constitutional changes at Suicide Prevention Australia. Yeah, so a bit of background to why the change is being raised today. So in 2012, myself and a group of others were appointed to SPA's first lived experience advisory group, which aimed at providing policy advice for the organisation from a lived experience lens. Now, this group was reinvented a few times over the next few years, and in 2015, there was a disagreement between all but two members of the group and the SPA board over their definition of lived experience, and this led to the resignation of everyone but two members. SPA decided not to refill the vacant positions, and the committee was dissolved. Now, at this time, SPA still maintained a lived experience network, but there was no direct lived experience voice within the SPA management team, and SPA did little to engage with their lived experience network. Then in 2018, SPA's manager of lived experience resigned, and there was no replacement advertised. I was advised at this time that SPA was moving to a focus on supporting members in their lived experience engagement rather than actually engaging with lived experience themselves. Now, with the lived experience network, people with lived experience had given their personal details to SPA, including details of their lived experience, to be involved in SPA's work, but it now had no coordinator and it began to fall by the wayside. And this was the last lived experience influence that the organisation had at the time. SPA also had a leadership change around this time, and they began to focus on members only. And there were calls to re-engage with lived experience perspectives. These were raised by myself and other key leaders in the space over the years from 2016 till today, but these have been mostly dismissed by SPA directors and leadership. And the reason frequently cited was that members have lived experience in their organisations and SPA represent their members, so there's default inclusion of lived experience. If you are interested in this early correspondence and the arguments put for and against lived experience at SPA, let me know and I'll send you copies of our correspondence. As the advocacy had met resistance over the years, and without due consideration to members on what SPA should be doing to embrace lived experience voices, Critical are now moving to a more formal process for moving SPA into alignment with the government and sector appetite for lived experience inclusion, and this is to be achieved through constitutional change. You see, constitutions hold organisations to account. They're binding documents that must be adhered to and cannot be changed easily. They make clear how the organisation operates and act as a guidebook to the crucial elements of operation. They're also an agreement between an organisation and its members, an agreement that can hold organisations to account. So if we jump back to 2014, this was the last time SPA's constitution was changed. And the clause that was to restrict voting for the election of directors to organisational members only was added. This clause was added to make way for an overhaul of the SPA membership fee structure, where organisational fees were increased significantly. I was responsible as a paid staff member for developing and implementing this membership program. And at this time, the financial security of the organisation was unclear, and the expensive fees were seen as a way of securing funding for the organisation. Now, to this day, membership fees are only a really small portion of SPA's revenue, with just under 4% of all revenue coming from memberships in the last financial year. Actually, over 90% of SPA's revenue comes from grants and donations. So, in this history, SPA were true leaders in including lived experience perspectives in their work until their focus shifted to prioritising organisational members. Now, finally, in 2019, SPA created a panel of people with lived experience who they could ask for advice, but these were volunteer positions until September last year, when a rate of $50 an hour was introduced. This rate is well below the sector standard, and that's the National Mental Health Commission's paid participation policy. Now, Critical believes that our peak body needs a formal and documented nudge to do better when it comes to lived experience inclusion in the move from mere platitudes to something a little bit more meaningful. So, two elements of the Constitution are up for discussion today, and I'll present them both and then we can talk them through one by one with your thoughts. So, firstly, the Constitution should set out the process for electing or appointing directors and any requirements a board has related to its composition. And for SPA, there are two types of directors: elected and appointed independent directors. At SPA, the number of elected directors must always be less than the number of appointed directors. So it's really hard to either be elected or appointed without being known to the board and members. The makeup of the board then becomes a kind of friends club as people become board members when they're familiar with the existing board and their members. It's not ideal, and it can introduce things like groupthink that reduce the effectiveness of a board. Now, it's not been until the election of Graham Holdsworth that an SPA board member has openly acknowledged their lived experience or been a recognised lived experience leader. And so it's not possible to track lived experience representation on the board at SPA before 2021 when he was elected. Critical spoke to Graham last year about what it's like being a person with lived experience on a board, and he spoke of the immense effort that it took in contacting all 200 plus organisational members just to win enough votes to be elected. So what's a better way? Some of SPA's member organisations include clauses in their constitutions that require some or all of their board members to have lived experience. So our first proposal does this by ensuring at least one director will have lived experience. SPA have expressed support for this change. You can see that in the presentation. And they've proposed their own wording, which includes a definition of lived experience. And it requires that the director must also have lived experience leadership skills, although that particular element is not defined. We're simply asking that at least one member has a lived experience. Now, the second proposal works to tackle the same issue. The suicide prevention sector and mental health sector generally has a long history of doing to people with lived experience, retaining power and control over the lives of people who experience suicide. And within SPA, the same historic imbalance was implemented in 2014, with organisations being the only ones who were empowered to elect directors for the peak that claims that lived experience is central to everything that we do. Now, I'm aware that restriction of membership rights are common within similar organisations, but that doesn't make them right or just. So the second proposal will reverse the decision made in 2014. It will remove the clause that was introduced then and return the Constitution to the original intent of SPA, and that is a peak body for all in suicide prevention. SPA have made claims that this change will dilute the value of organisational memberships, since they're more costly than associate members, but To me, this simply highlights their lack of effort in creating a membership program that provides real value for members. Now, SBA were invited to the consultation today to present their views on the proposals, but they declined to participate. Raising of these issues has been quite a challenge. Critical raised the changes for discussion and awareness of members at the last year's AGM, to which we were not given an opportunity to speak, and so these changes were not able to be raised. A formal complaint was made, but no action to remedy was taken. Critical have been in discussion with SPA over these changes for over a year, and we've encouraged SPA to notify members multiple times. Now, a member communique was finally sent out last week, which had a biased paper, and it was nearly a year since we raised these to the SPA. In the paper, there are other key changes to the proposal. Other key changes proposed, which includes the addition of a clause that prevents members raising a motion to change the Constitution without a 5% support of the membership. Now, this seems in direct response to the change being proposed, and it seems like an attempt at silencing future advocacy from people with lived experience and the organisations who represent them. So with the lack of public consultation from SPA, we started testing support publicly in May this year, and very quickly we had over 100 signatures of support. To put that into context, there are 187 organisations on SPA's member list and 227 associates. The support we got amounted to about a third of the SPA member base, and that's without having a list of members to contact. So there is public support for these changes. There is a perception that this move to make space for people with lived experience in places of leadership is important for the public good.